In Chapter 7, we're going to shift our focus to individual and group decision making. As we all are familiar with, a decision is a choice made from among available alternatives. Decision making is a process of identifying and choosing alternative courses of actions. Decisions can be made rationally, but often decision making is non-rational. Daniel Kahneman, the winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics, described two kinds of thinking which he labeled System 1 and System 2. System 1 is intuitive and largely unconscious. This operates automatically and quickly. It's often our fast, automatic, intuitive, and largely unconscious mode, as when we detect hostility in a voice or detect that one object is more distant than another. In System 2, this is more analytical and conscious. This is our slow, deliberate, analytical, and conscious effort mode of reasoning, which swings into action when we have to fill out a tax reform or park a car in a narrow space. Rational model of decision making explains how managers should make decisions. It assumes that managers will make logical decisions that will be optimal in furthering the organization's best interest. This decision-making model is also called the classical model, and typically there are 4 stages associated with rational decision-making, and we are going to discuss those on the next slide. The 4 steps in the rational decision-making model include Stage 1 is identifying the problem or opportunity. Stage 2 is to think up alternative solutions. Stage 3 is to evaluate alternatives and select a solution. And Stage 4 is to implement and evaluate the solution chosen. For implementation to be successful, a manager needs to do 2 things. The first one is to plan carefully. Especially if reversing an action will be difficult, you need to make sure you have careful plans for implementation. Some decisions may require written plans. The second item is you need to be sensitive to those affected. You need to consider how the people affected may feel about the change, inconvenienced, insecure, even fearful, all of which can trigger resistance. This is why it helps to give employees and customers latitude during a changeover in a business practice or working arrangement. When we look at the rational model, we have to think about what may be wrong with it. The rational model is prescriptive. It describes how managers ought to make decisions. It doesn't necessarily describe how managers actually make decisions. Indeed, the rational model makes some highly desirable assumptions, that the managers have complete information, that they're able to make unemotional analysis, and that they are able to make the best decision for the organization. We all know that sometimes these assumptions are unrealistic. This slide displays some hindrances to perfectly rational decision making. You guys can read them, but I think it's pretty clear to see how this can disrupt, any of these, can disrupt the perfect rational decision-making process. A lot of times we don't have perfect information. A lot of times we have too much information. What do we do about time and money constraints and conflicting goals? These are all things to think about when discussing the rational decision-making model. We are now going to turn our attention to the non-rational decision-making model. This model assumes that decision-making is nearly always uncertain and risky, making it difficult for managers to make optimal decisions. There are 2 types of non-rational models of decision-making. This is satisficing and intuition. It's important to keep in mind that the non-rational models are descriptive rather than prescriptive. They describe how managers actually make decisions rather than how they should. During the 1950s, economist Herbert Simon, who later also received the Nobel Prize, began to study how managers actually make decisions. From his research, he proposed that managers could not truly logically act because the rationality was bounded by so many restrictions. Bounded rationality says that some of these restrictions include complexity, time and money, and cognitive capacity. The satisfying model states that because of constraints, managers don't make an exhaustive search for the best alternative. Instead, managers seek alternatives until they find one that is satisfactory but not optimal. While satisficing might seem to be a weakness, it may well outweigh any advantages gained from delaying a decision until all information is in and all alternatives are weighed. Intuition is making a choice without the use of conscious thought or logical inference. Intuition stems from two things. The first is the amount of expertise you have about a person, a situation, an object, or a decision opportunity. This taken together is known as a holistic hunch. And the second thing that it stems from is the automated response. This is the involuntary emotional response to those same matters. Evidence-based decision-making is the translation of principles based on the best evidence into organizational practice. This brings rationality to the decision-making process. From the textbook, there is this quote, "Too many companies and too many leaders are more interested in just copying others, doing what they've always done, and making decisions based on beliefs and what ought to work rather than what actually works. They fail to face the hard facts and use the best evidence to help navigate the competitive environment." So in this model, the evidence and the facts are what matter. Just as we saw with the rational decision-making model, there are also items that make it hard to be evidence-based. Sometimes, again, you have too much evidence. Sometimes there's not enough good evidence. Sometimes people are trying to mislead you or you are trying to mislead you. These are just items to keep in mind and to remember that despite your best intentions, sometimes it's hard to bring the best evidence to bear on your decisions in the workplace. When we discuss decision-making styles, these reflect the combination of how an individual perceives and responds to information. They may have a value orientation, which reflects the extent to which a person focuses on either the task or the technical concerns, or are they people and social concern focused when making decisions. It also takes into account their tolerance for ambiguity. This is the extent to which a person has a high need for structure or control in his or her life. Figure 7.4 shows the 4 general decision-making styles. When looking at this grid, you can see that on the X and Y axes we have plotted tolerance for ambiguity as well as value orientation. If you are analytical, you have a high tolerance for ambiguity and your orientation tends to be towards task and technical concerns. If you are a directive decision-making style, you have a low tolerance for ambiguity as well as a task and technical value orientation. The conceptual and behavioral decision-making styles are more towards the people and social concerns value orientation. And if you are conceptual, you have a high tolerance for ambiguity. And if you are behavioral decision-making style dominant, you tend to have a low tolerance for ambiguity. There are methods that you can use to overcome barriers to decision making. This slide describes 4 ineffective reactions. The first is relaxed avoidance. This is taking no action in the belief that there will be no negative consequences. Relaxed change is realizing complete inaction will have a negative consequence, but opts for the first available alternative. Defensive avoidance is when you can't find a good solution, and this is followed by either procrastinating, passing the buck, or denying the risk. And then finally, you can reach panic. This is frantic to get rid of the problem that one can't deal with when the situation can't be dealt with realistically. These are the 4 defective problem recognition and problem-solving approaches that act as barriers when you must make an important decision in a situation of conflict. 3 effective reactions that you can have are dealing with the importance, credibility, and urgency. In deciding to decide, a manager agrees that he or she must decide what to do about a problem or opportunity and take effective decision-making steps. 3 ways to help you decide whether to decide are to evaluate the importance, credibility, and urgency of the situation. In importance, you're looking at how high of a priority is this situation. If it's a threat, how extensive might the prospective losses or damage be? If it's an opportunity, how beneficial might the possible gains be? When looking at credibility, you're asking how believable is the information about the situation. You need to evaluate how much is known about the possible threat or opportunity. Is the source of information trustworthy, and is there credible evidence? Finally, when you're looking at urgency, you're trying to decide how quickly you must act on the information about the situation. Is the threat immediate? Will the window of opportunity stay open long? Can actions to address the situation be done gradually? There are 9 common decision-making biases. These are the common items that are also called heuristics that simplify the process of making decisions. The first is the availability bias. This is when managers only use information that is readily available from memory to make judgments. The second type is the representative bias. This refers to the tendency to generalize from a small sample or a single event. When people seek information to support their point of view and discount data that do not, this is known as the confirmation bias. When managers add up all the money already spent on a project and conclude it's too costly to simply abandon it, this is known as the sunk cost bias. The tendency to make decisions based on an initial figure is anchoring and adjustment bias. The overconfidence bias is the bias in which people's subjective confidence in their decision making is greater than their objective accuracy. The hindsight bias is the tendency of people to view events as being more predictable than they really are. The framing bias is the tendency of decision makers to be influenced by the way a situation or problem is presented to them. And then finally, the escalation of commitment bias occurs when decision makers increase their commitment to a project despite negative information about it. Using a group to make decisions offers these 5 possible advantages. A greater pool of knowledge, you get different perspectives, intellectual stimulation, better understanding of decision rationale, and a deeper commitment to the decision. For these benefits to happen, however, the group must be made up of diverse participants, not just people who all think the same way. This slide looks at the disadvantages of group decision making. One disadvantage is that a few people may dominate or intimidate. Sometimes a handful of people will talk the longest and the loudest, and the rest of the group will simply give in. Or one individual, such as a strong leader, will exert disproportionate influence, sometimes by intimidation. This cuts down on the variety of ideas. Satisficing, if you remember, is the good enough decision. Because most people would just as soon cut short a meeting, the tendency is to seek a decision that is good enough, rather than to push on in pursuit of other possible solutions. Satisficing can occur because groups have limited time, lack of the right information, or are unable to handle a large amount of information. With goal displacement, although the primary task of the meeting may be to solve a particular problem, other considerations may rise to the fore, such as rivals trying to win an argument. And then finally, groupthink. This occurs when members strive to agree for the sake of being unanimous, and thus avoid accurately assessing the decision situation. Here, the positive team spirit of the group actually works against sound judgment, and if you guys have time, you should look at the documentary about the Challenger explosion. This is a key example and a case study on groupthink and how high-functioning individuals can make a decision that may lead to negative consequences. Here are some symptoms of groupthink. The first is a sense of invulnerability. This is when group members have the illusion that nothing can go wrong, and this can breed excessive optimism and risk-taking. They may also be assured of the rightness of their actions, that they ignore the ethical implications. The second system is rationalization. This protects the pet assumptions underlying the group's decisions from critical questions. The illusion of being unanimous and peer pressure is another way of saying that a member's silence is interpreted as consent. If people do not agree, peer pressure leads other members to question the dissenter's loyalty. And finally, the wisdom of the crowds. Groupthink's pressure to conform often leads members with different ideas to censor themselves. The opposite of collective wisdom. How do you think you can combat groupthink? The main way is to allow criticism and to allow other perspectives. If you are a manager deliberating whether to call a meeting for group input, here are some characteristics of groups that you should be aware of. Groups do take longer to make decisions. Their size also affects the quality of those decisions. The optimal group size may be 5 or 7 people, and odd group numbers are the best. This is because it also helps break ties in decision making. Groups may be too confident, and to remember the knowledge of the people that make up the group counts and is very important. This slide discusses 3 practical guidelines for when a group can help make decisions. The first is when it can increase quality. If additional information would increase the quality of the decision, managers should involve those people who can provide the needed information. If a type of decision occurs frequently, such as deciding on promotions or who qualifies for a loan, groups should be used because they tend to produce more consistent decisions than individuals do. Groups can also help in decision making when it can increase acceptance. If acceptance within the organization is important, managers need to involve those individuals whose acceptance and commitment are important. And finally, groups can help when it can increase development. If people can be developed through their participation, managers may want to involve those for which development is most important. The last topic we are going to cover in Chapter 7 is group problem-solving techniques. The first technique is consensus. This occurs when members are able to express their opinions and reach agreement to support the final decision. Please note that this does not mean that all members, that 100% of the members, vote in favor of the approach that will be used. It does mean that people are able to express their opinions and that the majority are able to at least support the final decision. Finally, brainstorming is a technique that is used to help groups generate multiple ideas and alternatives for solving problems. Keep in mind, here you should not stop the flow of ideas. You want ideas to come as fast as possible, and you don't want to tell somebody their idea is not a good one, because if you do, that might shut others down from participating as well. The Delphi technique is used when face-to-face discussions are impractical. For example, if you have a sales force that lives all throughout the United States or even the globe, it isn't possible to always get them in a room to make a decision together. It's also practical when disagreements and conflicts are likely to impair communication, when certain individuals might try to dominate group discussions, and when there is a high risk of groupthink. The Delphi technique is that group process that uses physically dispersed experts to fill out questionnaires to anonymously generate ideas. The judgments are then combined and averaged to achieve a consensus of expert opinion. This was originally designed for technological forecasting, but it's now used as a multi-purpose planning tool, and it is very common. Please let me know if you have any questions on Chapter 7.